What do you do when you're 78 years old, living on $600 a month, and the city wants to fine you $500 for tall grass in your yard? This was the question that hung heavy in the air of Providence Municipal Court on a humid Tuesday morning in 2019. The courtroom, typically filled with the routine shuffle of traffic violations and municipal infractions, suddenly felt different. In the defendant's chair sat Dorothy Williams, a frail woman whose weathered hands trembled as she clutched a manila envelope containing what little documentation she could gather to explain her situation. Judge Frank Caprio looked up from his bench, his kind eyes immediately noticing something that most judges might overlook: the way Dorothy's shoulders sagged not just from age, but from the weight of worry that had been crushing her for months. Her citation was for failure to maintain property standards, a violation that carried a hefty fine she simply couldn't afford. But this wasn't just another case number to be processed and dismissed. The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning. Even the court officers seemed to sense that something significant was about to unfold. Dorothy had been dreading this moment for weeks, losing sleep over the possibility of adding another financial burden to her already impossible situation. She lived alone in the small house her late husband had left her, a modest two-bedroom home that had become both her sanctuary and her burden. As Judge Caprio reviewed her case file, the details painted a picture of someone caught in an impossible situation. The city had cited her property for grass that had grown too tall, weeds that had overtaken her small front yard, and general maintenance issues that she simply couldn't address. The fine of $500 represented nearly an entire month of her Social Security income, money that was already stretched thin between her medications, utilities, and basic groceries. "Mrs. Williams," Judge Caprio said gently, setting down the paperwork and looking directly at her, "tell me about your situation. Help me understand what's been happening." The question itself was remarkable. In most municipal courts, defendants are expected to simply pay their fines or contest the charges based on legal technicalities. Few judges take the time to understand the human story behind the violation. But Judge Caprio had built his reputation on exactly this approach, seeing beyond the citation to the person standing before him. Dorothy's voice was barely above a whisper as she began to explain. She had been maintaining her property as best she could for years after her husband's death, but recent health problems had made yard work increasingly difficult. A fall the previous winter had left her with lingering back pain, and her arthritis had worsened to the point where holding gardening tools was sometimes impossible. "I tried to hire someone," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "but I can't afford it. I called several services, and they all wanted more money than I receive in a month." The courtroom remained silent as Dorothy continued her explanation. She had contacted her neighbors hoping someone might help or know of an affordable solution, but many of them were elderly themselves and facing similar challenges. She had even reached out to local churches and community organizations, but the waiting lists for assistance were long, and her citation had come with a deadline she couldn't meet. Judge Caprio listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking gentle follow-up questions. This wasn't the first time he had encountered someone trapped between municipal regulations and genuine hardship, but each case still moved him. He understood that behind every citation was a human being, often struggling with circumstances beyond their control. As Dorothy finished explaining her situation, she reached into her manila envelope and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, an estimate from a landscaping company for $300 to clean up her yard. "I got this quote," she said, "but I just don't have the money. If I pay this fine and hire someone to fix the yard, I won't be able to buy my heart medication next month." The weight of her words settled over the courtroom like a blanket. Here was a woman who had worked her entire life, raised a family, and contributed to her community, now forced to choose between legal compliance and her health. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation that Judge Caprio had made his mission to address with compassion rather than rigid adherence to municipal code. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, clearly contemplating not just the legal aspects of the case, but the moral implications of his decision. The cameras that regularly filmed his court proceedings for the television show Caught in Providence captured every nuance of this moment. the judge's thoughtful expression, Dorothy's anxious fidgeting, and the palpable tension in the room. "Mrs. Williams," he said finally, "I want you to know that I've heard every word you've said, and I understand your situation completely. No one in that courtroom, not Dorothy, not the court officers, not even the experienced camera crew, expected what Judge Caprio would say next." The pause that followed seemed to stretch on forever, filled with anticipation and hope that justice might, for once, come with a human heart attached. To understand the full impact of what was about to unfold in that Providence courtroom, you need to understand Dorothy Williams, not just as a defendant, but as a person whose life story embodied both the struggles and the quiet dignity of countless elderly Americans. Dorothy had lived in the same neighborhood for 43 years. She and her husband Robert had bought their modest home in 1976, when the area was a thriving middle-class community filled with young families and well-maintained properties. Robert worked at a local manufacturing plant, while Dorothy raised their 3 children and worked part-time as a school crossing guard, a job that allowed her to be home when the kids needed her. The house on Maple Street had been their American dream, a small 2-bedroom ranch with a front yard where Robert grew tomatoes every summer, and Dorothy planted flowers along the walkway. Their children learned to ride bikes on that sidewalk, played catch in the backyard, and brought their own children to visit Grandma and Grandpa in the home that had become the anchor of their family. But dreams, like neighborhoods, can change over time. Robert's plant closed in 2003, forcing him into early retirement with reduced benefits. The area around their home began to decline as younger families moved to newer suburbs, leaving behind aging residents who struggled to maintain properties on fixed incomes. What had once been a source of pride home ownership gradually became a financial burden. When Robert passed away in 2015, after a brief battle with cancer, Dorothy found herself alone for the first time in nearly 50 years. The house that had once buzzed with family activity became quiet and overwhelming. Tasks that Robert had handled, the heavy yard work, minor repairs, seasonal maintenance, suddenly fell to a 74-year-old woman already dealing with grief and the shock of reduced household income. "I never realized how much Robert did until he wasn't there to do it anymore," Dorothy had confided to her daughter during one of their weekly phone calls. Living on Social Security alone meant careful budgeting of every dollar, and there was simply no room in her $600 monthly income for lawn services or home maintenance. Dorothy's situation was far from unique. According to housing advocates, millions of elderly homeowners across America face similar challenges, caught between the desire to remain in homes filled with memories and the harsh reality of limited resources to maintain them. Many find themselves targeted by municipal code enforcement, creating a cruel irony where the very communities they helped build in their younger years now find them for their inability to maintain those same standards. In most municipal courts, Dorothy's case would have been handled with bureaucratic efficiency. The judge would have reviewed the citation, perhaps asked if she wanted to contest the charges, and then either imposed the fine or set up a payment plan. The human story behind the violation, the widowhood, the fixed income, the physical limitations, would have been irrelevant to the legal proceedings. But Judge Frank Caprio had built his reputation on a different approach entirely. Over his decades on the bench, he had become known for what legal scholars call therapeutic jurisprudence, the idea that the legal system should heal rather than just punish. His courtroom in Providence had become a place where justice was tempered with mercy, where understanding often mattered more than strict legal interpretation. The television show, Caught in Providence, had made Judge Caprio famous precisely because viewers around the world were hungry to see justice delivered with compassion. In an era where institutions often felt cold and impersonal, his courtroom offered something different, a place where people's stories mattered, where judges listened with their hearts as well as their legal training. As Dorothy sat in that defendant's chair, she represented thousands of people who find themselves on the wrong side of regulations they can't comply with through no fault of their own. Her trembling hands and worried expression told a story that went far beyond tall grass and municipal codes. It was a story about aging with dignity in a system that often seems designed to make that impossible. Judge Caprio understood this broader context. He had seen countless cases where rigid enforcement of municipal regulations created hardships that served no legitimate public purpose. A fine that might be a minor inconvenience to a middle-class homeowner could represent a catastrophic financial crisis to someone living on a fixed income. "Mrs. Williams," Judge Caprio had said, "tell me about your neighbors. Do they understand your situation?" It was a question that revealed his deeper understanding of how communities work. Dorothy explained that several of her neighbors were in similar situations, elderly residents struggling to maintain properties on limited incomes. Some had family members who helped when they could, but others, like Dorothy, were largely on their own. The judge's questions weren't just about gathering information for his legal decision. They were about understanding Dorothy as a whole person, recognizing her dignity even in this difficult moment. This approach had made Judge Caprio beloved not just in Providence, but around the world, where millions of viewers had watched him transform moments of potential humiliation into experiences of human connection and understanding. As Dorothy answered his gentle questions, sharing details about her late husband, her health challenges, and her genuine efforts to maintain her property despite her limitations, something beautiful was happening in that courtroom. The rigid machinery of municipal law was being softened by human compassion, creating space for a kind of justice that served both the law and the person standing before it. What happened next would not only change Dorothy's life, but would remind millions of viewers around the world why Judge Frank Caprio had earned the title America's Kindest Judge. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the gentle hum of the air conditioning as Judge Caprio leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together on the bench before him. Dorothy Williams sat in the defendant's chair, her manila envelope now empty on her lap, having shared every document and explanation she could muster. The moment hung suspended between question and answer, between bureaucratic routine and human compassion. "Mrs. Williams," Judge Caprio said, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him beloved by millions of viewers worldwide. "I want you to look at me for a moment." Dorothy raised her eyes, which had been fixed nervously on her hands throughout most of her testimony. The judge's expression was gentle but serious, the look of someone who understood that his next words would have profound consequences for the elderly woman sitting before him. "In 40 years on this bench," he continued, "I've learned that there's a difference between someone who won't follow the law and someone who can't follow the law. You, Mrs. Williams, clearly fall into the second category." A subtle shift occurred in the courtroom atmosphere. The court officers, who had seen thousands of cases processed through this room, seemed to sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. Even the camera operators, accustomed to capturing Judge Caprio's compassionate moments, appeared to focus more intently on the unfolding scene. "Your property citation calls for a $500 fine," Judge Caprio said, picking up the paperwork that had brought Dorothy to his courtroom. "But I'm looking at a woman who is clearly doing her best under difficult circumstances. You're 78 years old, living on $600 a month, and you've just explained to me that paying this fine would mean choosing between legal compliance and your heart medication." Dorothy's eyes began to fill with tears, though she tried to maintain her composure. She had prepared herself for the worst-case scenario, a payment plan that would stretch her already impossible budget even thinner, or perhaps community service that her physical limitations would make difficult to complete. "Now I could simply dismiss this fine," Judge Caprio continued, "but that wouldn't solve your underlying problem, would it? Your yard would still need maintenance, and you'd still be facing the same challenges that brought you here in the first place." The judge paused, appearing to weigh his options carefully. This was the moment that would define not just Dorothy's immediate future, but would demonstrate the kind of creative problem-solving that had made Judge Caprio's approach to justice so revolutionary. "Mrs. Williams, I'm going to do something a little different today," he said, his voice taking on a tone of gentle authority. "First, I'm dismissing your fine entirely. You will not pay 1 penny for this citation." An audible gasp came from somewhere in the courtroom gallery, where a few other defendants waited for their cases to be called. Dorothy's hand moved to her chest as if she needed to steady her heart. "But," Judge Caprio continued, raising his hand slightly, "I'm not stopping there. I'm going to make some phone calls." What happened next would become one of the most widely shared moments in the history of Caught in Providence. Judge Caprio explained that he had developed relationships with local community organizations and volunteer groups over his years on the bench. These connections weren't just professional networking, they were part of his philosophy that the justice system should connect people with solutions, not just impose penalties. I know several local church groups and community organizations that help elderly residents with yard maintenance, he said. I'm going to personally ensure that someone comes to help you get your property back into compliance at no cost to you. Dorothy's composed facade finally cracked, and tears began flowing freely down her cheeks. But these weren't tears of fear or embarrassment. They were tears of relief and overwhelming gratitude. For months she had felt trapped and alone, unable to solve her problem despite her best efforts. Now, in a single moment, a judge she had never met was not just excusing her violation, but actively working to help her address the underlying issue. "Your Honor," Dorothy managed to say through her tears, "I don't know how to thank you." Judge Caprio's response revealed the heart that had made him famous around the world. "Mrs. Williams, you don't need to thank me. You worked your whole life, you raised a family, and you've been a contributing member of this community for decades. When our community's elders need help, it's our responsibility to provide it." The judge then did something that surprised even the experienced court staff. He stood up from his bench and walked around to where Dorothy was sitting. Taking her hands in his, he looked directly into her eyes and said, "You are not a burden on this community, Mrs. Williams. You are a treasure that this community has a responsibility to protect." The moment was captured by the cameras that day, but no recording could fully convey the transformation that occurred in that courtroom. What had begun as a routine municipal violation hearing had become something much more profound, a demonstration of how justice could serve not just the law, but human dignity. Judge Caprio returned to his bench and made good on his promise immediately. He placed a phone call to a local church group that coordinated volunteer services for elderly residents. Within minutes, he had arranged for a team of volunteers to visit Dorothy's property the following weekend to address all of the maintenance issues mentioned in her citation. "Mrs. Williams," he said, after completing his phone call, "I want you to go home and not worry about this anymore. The volunteers will contact you directly to schedule a convenient time, and they'll take care of everything. Your case is dismissed, your fine is eliminated, and your problem is solved." As Dorothy gathered her empty manila envelope and prepared to leave, she turned back to Judge Caprio one final time. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady now, "you've given me back my peace of mind. I haven't slept well in months because of this, and now I can go home and rest." The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause, not just from the gallery, but from the court officers and staff who had witnessed something truly extraordinary. This wasn't just about municipal codes or property maintenance. It was about treating people with dignity and recognizing that sometimes justice requires creativity, compassion, and a willingness to see beyond the letter of the law to its spirit. As Dorothy left the courtroom that day, she carried with her not just dismissed charges, but restored faith in the possibility that institutions could still serve people with kindness and understanding. The video of Dorothy Williams's court appearance would eventually be viewed by over 20 million people across social media platforms, becoming one of the most shared clips in the history of Caught in Providence. But the numbers, impressive as they were, only told part of the story. The real impact of that Tuesday morning in Providence lay in what it revealed about the kind of justice people desperately hunger for in an increasingly impersonal world. Within hours of the episode's broadcast, Dorothy's story had touched hearts across the globe. Comments poured in from viewers in dozens of countries, each expressing the same sentiment. This was how justice should work. People shared their own stories of elderly relatives facing similar challenges, of communities that had rallied to help neighbors in need, and of their gratitude for seeing kindness elevated over bureaucracy. "This is what America should be," wrote one viewer from Germany, "a place where judges remember they're dealing with human beings, not just case numbers." The response to Dorothy's case reflected a deeper truth about Judge Frank Caprio's approach to justice. Over his decades on the bench, he had consistently demonstrated that the law could be both firm and compassionate, that accountability didn't require cruelty, and that sometimes the most just solution was the one that addressed not just the legal violation, but the human circumstances that created it. Local news stations picked up Dorothy's story, interviewing legal experts who explained how Judge Caprio's approach represented a growing movement in the justice system called problem-solving courts. These specialized venues focus on addressing the root causes of legal problems rather than simply imposing penalties. Drug courts, mental health courts, and community courts all operate on similar principles. The idea that lasting solutions require understanding the whole person, not just their violation. Judge Caprio wasn't just being nice, explained Professor Maria Rodriguez, a legal scholar who studies innovative approaches to justice. He was practicing what we call therapeutic jurisprudence, using the authority of the court to heal rather than just punish. It's more effective at preventing future violations, and it builds public trust in the justice system. The volunteers who helped Dorothy with her yard work reported that the experience had been as meaningful for them as it was for her. Members of St. Mary's Catholic Church who had responded to Judge Caprio's phone call spent an entire Saturday transforming Dorothy's property. They not only addressed the immediate code violations, but also set up an ongoing maintenance schedule to prevent future problems. Working in Dorothy's yard reminded us why we do this kind of community service, said volunteer coordinator James Mitchell. She wasn't looking for a handout. She was dealing with circumstances beyond her control. Judge Caprio saw that and found a way to help that preserved her dignity while solving the problem. Dorothy herself became something of a local celebrity, though she handled the attention with the same quiet grace she had shown in court. Local newspapers interviewed her about her experience, and she consistently emphasized how Judge Caprio's approach had not just solved her immediate problem, but had restored her faith in the possibility of compassionate governance. "I had started to feel like nobody cared about people like me anymore," Dorothy told a reporter. "Judge Caprio showed me that there are still people in positions of authority who see us as human beings, not just problems to be processed." The ripple effects of Dorothy's case extended far beyond her own situation. Other municipal courts began examining their own practices, asking whether their approach to code enforcement was serving the broader goal of community well-being. Several cities implemented new policies allowing judges to consider economic hardship when imposing fines for property maintenance violations. Judge Caprio's handling of Dorothy's case also sparked conversations about broader social issues affecting elderly Americans. Advocacy groups used the viral video as a springboard for discussions about affordable housing, healthcare costs, and community support systems for aging populations. The case became a symbol of how individual acts of compassion could illuminate larger systemic challenges. Dorothy Williams represents millions of elderly Americans who are struggling to age in place with dignity, said advocacy group spokesperson Linda Chen. Judge Caprio's response shows us what's possible when our institutions remember their fundamental purpose: serving people. The broader legacy of Judge Frank Caprio, embodied in moments like Dorothy's case, offers a vision of justice that transcends legal technicalities. His approach demonstrated that courts could be places of healing rather than just punishment, that judges could be problem solvers rather than just rule enforcers, and that the law could serve humanity rather than the other way around. In a world often characterized by institutional coldness and bureaucratic indifference, Judge Caprio's courtroom became a beacon of hope. His treatment of Dorothy Williams wasn't exceptional because it was kind. It was exceptional because kindness had become so rare in institutional settings that millions of people were moved to tears by witnessing it. The true measure of Judge Caprio's legacy lies not in the individual cases he resolved with compassion, but in the way those cases inspired others to approach their own responsibilities with greater humanity. Teachers, social workers, healthcare providers, and public servants around the world shared Dorothy's video with the same message: this is how we should treat the people we serve. Dorothy Williams returned to her well-maintained home that evening, but she carried with her something more valuable than dismissed charges or a clean yard. She had experienced justice delivered with dignity, authority exercised with compassion, and institutional power used in service of human flourishing. In a single morning, Judge Frank Caprio had not just resolved her legal problem, he had restored her faith in the possibility that our institutions could still serve us with kindness. This was Judge Caprio's greatest achievement, not just dispensing justice, but demonstrating that justice and compassion were not competing values, but complementary ones. In treating Dorothy Williams with dignity, he reminded millions of viewers around the world what justice could look like when it was guided by wisdom, tempered by mercy, and motivated by love. Thank you for watching this tribute to Judge Frank Caprio. His legacy lives on in every act of institutional kindness, every moment when authority chooses compassion over rigidity, and every time someone in power remembers that their role is to serve human dignity. If his story touched you, please share it with others so his message of kindness and fairness can continue to inspire the world.